Commission to Waihanga released its 243-page draft strategy containing 67 recommendations to government, local government and the infrastructure sector last month. It sets out a vision, but also highlights challenges, showing we need to improve our system for planning and building infrastructure, and to also make better use of what we already have. Most of the 67 recommendations address known issues, and work on some is already underway, including the resource management reform, emissions reduction, and a national digital strategy. The strategy raises a number of things the sector will be pleased by, which including an independent infrastructure priority list and the National Infrastructure Skills Plan among them. Infrastructure New Zealand has been working with the Commission and held a series of workshops around the country earlier this year, allowing members to provide direct input into the draft strategy. So it's my pleasure to now introduce Geoff Cooper, the General Manager Strategy, the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, to Waihanga to talk more about it. Geoff has a background in global policy, having worked for the United Nations, the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve. He is the former chief economist for Auckland Council, where he worked on infrastructure, housing, regulation and financial policy. More recently, as chief economist at PwC, Geoff has contributed to the economic appraisal of a range of large infrastructure projects, including Wellington Moving Programme, Auckland Light Rail, Hamilton to Auckland High Speed Rail, and Queenstown's Way to Go programme. Geoff holds a Masters of Economics with first class honours from the University of Auckland and has a Masters of Public Affairs from Princeton University. So welcome, Geoff.
Kia ora, Claire. Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for everybody for attending this one. Just first a quick shout out to Infrastructure New Zealand for again putting on a really fantastic conference, I think in trying circumstances. I think it, is sort of a testament to the skill that they have in being able to run conferences of such high quality. So I'm very happy to be here and to speak on a piece of work that has sort of consumed my waking and sometimes non-waking hours over the last year, and that is the draft New Zealand Infrastructure Strategy, Rautaki Hanganga o Aotearoa. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you a pretty quick flyby on this document. It is a large document. It covers a lot of terrain. I'll just say at the outset, my motivation here really is to give you enough nuggets to want to go and have a look at the document and look particularly at the areas which are most relevant to you, whichever sector it is that you are from, or whichever area of New Zealand you are listening into from as well. So look, let me just sort of start by talking a little bit about infrastructure generally. Infrastructure underpins the modern economy. It's why it's so important to New Zealanders, and indeed right now to the rest of the world as well, right? It's a topic of immense interest. We have sort of thought about infrastructure in three different layers that you'll sort of notice throughout the draft strategy. The first is the environmental layer. The second is sort of the social layer, social infrastructure layer. Sometimes this is referred to as vertical infrastructure or sometimes non-networked infrastructure. We get too bogged down by these kind of terminologies because there's a lot of sort of bleeding edges, if you like. But this is talking particularly about education and health, maybe justice, civic infrastructure, buildings that don't necessarily or rely less on a sort of networked approach, if you like. And then there's economic infrastructure, which speaks particularly to telecommunications, to water, to transport, to energy, and in some ways to waste as well. And these, of course, are the networks that are operating together and are functional because they're working as a network, right? And so it's when all of these things are coming together that, we have the experiences that we know every day of being able to get to the places that we sort of live in, work in, and play in. And so Te Waihanga really is charged as an institution to think across all of these sectors and to really understand the differences in how we deliver infrastructure services across all of these sectors and these particular networked and non-networked infrastructure. So look, I just want to sort of start by talking a little bit about, why infrastructure. What is it that education, health, water, transportation, and all of these sectors have in common? Why even have an infrastructure commission or an infrastructure strategy for that matter. And what it boils down to essentially is movement. Infrastructure is about movement. And sometimes that is electrons, and we call that the energy sector. Sometimes it's H2O, and that's the water sector. Sometimes we're moving light around, and we call that the telecommunications sector, or freight and goods, right? And that's transportation, or indeed sometimes we're moving ourselves around. Or sometimes we might be moving ideas around, right? And that's the education sector. And so, the reason why we're sort of bringing all of these things together is that there are some common attributes, some common good policies, if you like, and ways of running institutions and governance that apply when you're trying to move things around large swaths of land or indeed over international borders as well. And so we're trying to learn the principles of good infrastructure management and what we can learn across different sectors. Why is it that New Zealand, when we speak about moving electrons or light around, are particularly, in many ways globally leading, but when we're thinking about how we move water around or people around, we seem to put up with lower levels of service in some cases. Congestion seems to be a particular problem that we haven't solved in transportation sectors, but have solved quite well in energy sectors. And so we're able to ask those questions across the sectors that otherwise, if you're only focused on one sector, you might not be able to do so well. So look, there are many experiences of infrastructure. This is a diagram which is in the draft strategy. And the point that I want to sort of make here is that infrastructure in many ways is about land use, right? Is about the way that we use the land around us. And infrastructure services fundamentally are helping us live, work, and play in the regions and the places that we want to at the times that we want to. The next point I want to make about this is that when we're talking about infrastructure, we're really thinking about the services that come from infrastructure. And the infrastructure requirements to deliver those services are quite different across space, right? The way that you might deliver educational services in a city is quite different to the options that you might have when you're in a rural place and whatnot. So we can start thinking about the role of things like telecommunications to deliver educational or telehealth services in more remote places. What this sort of boils down to is that density helps us with more infrastructure options, right? When we have more density of businesses, density of households, we have more options to provide infrastructure because fundamentally we can spread the costs of infrastructure more easily. And what this means is that when you go to a city, the first thing you sort of notice is that there's a lot more infrastructure around you, right? And so, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but where people are locating is particularly important for infrastructure, but so is the planning rules that we have, right? That the things like the RMA are obviously central to the infrastructure choices that we have and can make. Another point that I sort of want to just introduce here is that sometimes we have non-built solutions available to us, right, that need to be considered as part of the overall settings of infrastructure that we have. And we've got an example of that in this chart. People can live close to work. It's one example of a solution which might require actually less infrastructure than placing or encouraging people to live in more distant places in a city. The last point that I'd sort of just make here is that obviously for much infrastructure, it's very visceral, it's very in our face. We experience it on a day-to-day basis when we pull out of our driveway and drive on the road. But much of the infrastructure that we have and rely on and supports both production and consumption of economic activity around us is underground. And out of sight is often out of mind. But it is very much a part of what we need to do to deliver high quality infrastructure services. So the context of our infrastructure is ever changing. Sometimes it sort of feels like infrastructure is a very slow moving area, but in many ways it is a very fast moving area. And when we think about the context that New Zealand sort of faces at the moment, and we need to, of course, look forward over long periods of time, since the infrastructure choices that we make today need to sort of take into account the changing landscape that we can expect over the next 30 years. And so the draft strategy sort of sets out what some of these sort of mission critical contextual changes are that we need to think about when we're designing up our business cases today. The first, of course, is that we have different concentrations of growth. New Zealand is projected to grow by some 1.2 million people over the next 30 years, and we could be as large as 7.4 million people. The next trend is that we're expecting a lot of this to occur in cities, and most of it will occur in one city, that being Auckland, which is expected to account for some 49% of all of New Zealand's growth. At the same time, not all areas are going to grow. And while infrastructure often centers itself around growth, the infrastructure challenges of decline are in some ways actually more difficult to address as funding bases dissipate and the challenge of maintaining and operating existing infrastructure gets more difficult. And lastly, of course, the demographic change that New Zealand is aging, and that speaks to the different infrastructure choices that we need to make, the locations that we make those in, and of course the funding implications as working age populations in some areas are growing at a slower rate than over 65. Just a quick shout out to the fact that infrastructure, because it is so forward-looking, introduces this uncertainty of demand growth. That whilst we can put forward Statistics New Zealand projections of where we expect growth to happen, if house prices or something else occurs in some cities that makes those cities less attractive, there is no reason why people won't react to those and move to other places. So, there is nothing certain about demand projections, and we need to be thinking about the value of flexibility in infrastructure and planning more generally. The last one I just want to highlight is that the climate is obviously changing. This is a big deal for infrastructure, both from a mitigation perspective and from an adaptation perspective. The economic transition that is required of us to meet our net zero carbon targets is immense. Electricity generation needs to increase by some 170%. We're going to see a massive change in the private vehicle fleet and whatnot. But at the same time, from an adaptation point of view, some $5 billion of council infrastructure is going to be affected by sea level rise. The adaptation is equally important. I'm going to sort of speed up here a little to try and leave some room for questions. But, we sort of wanted to set out the infrastructure challenge of New Zealand in one chart. And here's a few of the bits and pieces, sort of highlights of that challenge, whether we're talking about congestion charging, fixing up water networks, the houses that we haven't built or need to build, the energy transition or whatnot, the maintenance challenge, all of these things. And we wanted to try and bring this all together in one chart to show people the scale of the challenge that we're talking about here. We often talk about the infrastructure deficit. Some folks have put that at $75 billion. That is the number on the left there. When we are having a forward-looking view over the next 30 years of what we need to spend, we need to be thinking, of course, about these population growth changes, climate change issues and whatnot. That's our future infrastructure needs, which amount to about 2.7% of GDP. The renewals, which is some 4.6% of GDP, that's keeping the lights on, and the cost pressures, which if you look at past trends amount to about 1.6% of GDP, gets you to a number in the order of 10% of GDP. That's about $30 billion per year. We spend about half that at the moment. The strategy tries to bridge this gap. How do we reduce that gap between what we need and what we have? And we split everything up into 4 areas. The first of those is making better use of existing infrastructure. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The next is better project selection. That is the projects that we choose, making sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck of public investment. The third is broadening out the funding and financing choices that we have. And the last is streamlining the delivery of services here. The one point I want to sort of leave on this slide here is that closing the gap is not all about funding new infrastructure. Indeed, we see many options for making better use of existing infrastructure, and we've gone some way to try and provide as much detail on where we think those opportunities are as we possibly can. So, it is not all about new assets. In any given year, we add about 1% of the stock to of infrastructure. We need to be thinking about the other 99%, how we're managing that, how we're taking care of it, the asset management programs that we have in place and whatnot. And so the strategy tries to give some weighting towards that 99% rather than just the new infrastructure. When we think about options to make better use of infrastructure, I won't go through all of these in detail, but I wanted to leave you with some examples of the sort of things we're thinking about across all of the sectors we're looking at. Broadly, you can think about these in 4 different areas. The first is design, second is education, third is regulation, and fourth is price. And it's speaking to demand management options that we have to make better use of the infrastructure we already have around us. The strategic architecture of the strategy, I've tried to go over a little bit of this. It speaks to the people, technology, and climate change. That's our context. The vision, infrastructure that lays a foundation for the people, places, and businesses of Aotearoa, New Zealand to thrive for generations. The Te Ao Māori perspective of strengthening partnerships and unlocking opportunities for Māori, and thinking around all the various ways that Māori interact with our infrastructure system, from governance, development, all the way through to business and consumers of infrastructure as well. The principles, equitable, aspirational, and efficient, drive what we see as the objectives, the performance, and the results that we're looking for from our infrastructure sector. The objectives, the first one being enabling a net zero carbon emissions Aotearoa. The second one speaking to the importance of infrastructure for towns and regions in New Zealand, particularly important as we move forward in the sort of digital world, if you like. The third one there about the cities, and within sort of city movement, building attractive and inclusive cities. The fourth one being moving to a circular economy, and the third about strengthening resilience to shocks and stresses. Just quickly on the performance, this is the elements that go into actually making infrastructure. This is the decision-making, the governance, the institutions that we have, moving on to the funding and financing, the technology that we use, the workforce that we have, and the planning system that we have to go through in order to get infrastructure operational. So look, the strategy makes a total of 67 recommendations. You've heard a few of those. They include a national priority list, a consolidated infrastructure fund. It talks to the use of a national population plan for certainty. It talks about the need to make better use of corridors and future infrastructure corridor planning. It also talks about how we can make better use of technology, working towards a national digital twin, or indeed options for how we can make better use of existing infrastructure, whether that be pricing options like congestion charging, volumetric charging, the use of the waste levy, real-time parking and the like, or indeed things like upzoning and better use of mixed-use zoning in our cities, so that the infrastructure load that we need can be lighter. There are, of course, many others. So I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at the document and see the full gambit of things that we have been thinking about. Just to leave you with the process that we've gone through with this draft strategy, it currently is with the Minister under ministerial review, and we expect comments back from the Minister on the 24th of December. It's a nice Christmas present, and then we'll have 3 months to make changes to that, and it will be tabled in Parliament soon after March, with a government response thereafter. It has involved extensive feedback, and I just sort of like to finish, I suppose, by thanking probably folks listening to this right now who have taken the time to feed in and provide the information to us on the infrastructure strategy is better for that input. We have an incredibly decentralized system in New Zealand, and so the only way we can really hope to pull this together is by learning from the folks that are experiencing infrastructure on the ground. So I'll sort of leave it there, and I think we've got a few minutes for questions, so I'll hand back to Claire.
A few. What do you think is the future role of the Infrastructure Commission now that you've released your draft strategy?
Yeah, so the sort of strategy function of the Commission is just one function. We administer the national pipeline, and so we are looking at ways to improve that, improve the credibility of it, so that it is more comprehensive to the sector and more useful to the sector. We also provide advice into strategic projects. We're also looking to establish a centre of data excellence where we can bring better data together. And you'll see one of the sort of recommendations in the draft strategy is improving the data environment of infrastructure. I think the Commission has an important role to play in that. And we signal a number of areas in the draft strategy where we think the Commission has a role to play. Providing independent advice on projects, a national priority list has been mentioned in the draft strategy, and so we think that is a way forward as well. So at the moment, there's I think quite a few ideas, and we'll be waiting for the draft strategy to land before we start firming those up, I think would be the answer to that.
What do you think the role is for local government in implementing the strategy?
So as I sort of said, the infrastructure system that we have is incredibly decentralized. And so, the sort of standing of the document exists to the extent that people want to take these things up and use it as a mechanism to excite change in their institutions. I think the role of local government in executing the strategy is immense. It's one of the reasons why we engaged very early on with local government. My experience my background is in local government, so I understand the importance of local government in delivering infrastructure, and indeed the role they have in establishing where the opportunities for infrastructure across New Zealand are, right? This local information that local government has and is uniquely placed to access is really important in helping us to understand what national priorities are as well. So look, I think local government is incredibly important. They have their own infrastructure strategies, and I would like to think that this document will be useful when local government is putting those together.
Brilliant, thank you. National MP Andrew Bailey this morning said that the Commission is you might not be able to answer this because I know you're an official, but the Commission is hamstrung because it doesn't have all the powers it needs. Example, the ability to review key project proposals, etc. What powers would you like the Commission to have to be able to deliver its mandate?
Look, I think it's a good question, and it's one that I wouldn't obviously sort of speculate on right now. But I think that coming back to this point, that infrastructure is incredibly decentralized. One of the things that we went out with in our consultation document, probably about 4 months ago now, was a few recommendations around greater consolidation, right? And we talked about the role of some sort of centralized asset management team or a sort of harking back to the Ministry of Works days. And we got some really great feedback on that actually there's a big trade-off when you're thinking about consolidation. And I've already introduced that, spoken to it. It's local knowledge, right? And so there is a reason why we have a system which is decentralized. It has the benefit of being able to speak to those local needs more. And so, look, I think the powers that we need to have to implement our role in the system need to be looked at in that light. And I think there's a bit of thinking that we need to do to establish that. But the first thing we need to do is get consensus on what the strategy actually is. And so there's a bit of water to go under that bridge before we get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. Will the Infrastructure Commission get involved in delivery like the old Public Works Department?
No, not right now. And I mean, just to paraphrase, I think our chair, Alan Bollard, who spoke to this in the webinar on the draft strategy, a few weeks ago, he was sort of speaks quite vividly about his experience with the Ministry of Works because he was involved with it, and has, I think it's fair to say, doesn't think it's a solution to all of our problems. So we need to sort of go back into the history books to see what worked and what didn't.
Great, thank you. On housing, the draft speaks to making the most of existing infrastructure. Do you see an opportunity to adjust regulatory settings to ensure we are better able to use existing housing stock, for instance, empty homes that are both a waste of time and embodied in operational carbon?
Yeah, I mean, look, good question, and I think this one is an area where we've seen quite significant movement just in the last few weeks, right? I think that the sector is, coming to terms with what the MPSUD and the MDRS means in terms of how we go about designing and building our cities. We have been supportive of these policies because we think that it's going to mean that infrastructure is better able to be delivered, right? Because it enables more density in areas where people want to live. So I think that some of the regulatory change that we've actually seen over the last couple of months, and I know it's going to take some time before it actually becomes operational. I think the questions we actually should be asking right now is what do we need to be thinking to make the most of that regulatory change, because they're quite significant.
Great. I'll do one final question. Given large infrastructure projects are highly politicised and we have 3-year election cycles, what can the Commission do so we can provide more certainty around the long-term pipeline of works?
Yeah, great question. And this is one that we address in the decision-making section of the strategy. And what we do there is we lay out a series of hurdles, if you like, or best practices around decision-making. And so, what we're doing here is we're trying to set out an expectation of what good looks like, right? So that we have a sort of North Star to aim for. That's the first part of this. The second part of this is the national priority list that we've spoken to in here. And that really, at its heart, is about an independent assessment of infrastructure and holding an independent view about when something should be considered of national priority. So that is the essence of the national priority list. It is something that has precedent internationally. It's done in New South Wales, for instance. Where projects are put in, they're independently verified and have cost-benefit analysis done on them. And it's not just about projects, it's also about things that are called priority investigations, right? So where we know that there's a need that exists, investigating what options we have to solve that. So they speak to both investigations and projects as well. And that at the moment is the essence of that recommendation that exists in the draft strategy.
Great, thanks, Geoff. Well, we'll leave it there now, and thank you for your time today.
All right, thanks, Claire. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, we'll now jump in straight into the political part, the political discussion. So if you want to leave this session and rejoin that one, that would be great. Thank you.